Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. If this is the first video you're seeing on my channel, welcome. But this is part 2 of a 2-part video. So please do go back and watch Discussing the Girlfriends podcast, part 1. For those of you who are already caught up, let's pick up where we left off. Discussing the Girlfriends podcast, part 2. Let's talk about it. Okay, so if you remember from the last video, a torso had washed up on a beach in Staten Island, and some tests were done comparing the torso spine to some x-rays that Gail had taken a couple of years back. And they determined that the torso did belong to Gail. Her family did manage to lay it to rest, and they got somewhat of some closure from that. Unfortunately, in years that passed, her parents passed away. Gail's sister, Elaine, believes that her mom passed from a broken heart. So she does blame Bob for her mom's death as well. Her dad passed away from cancer a few years later. So the only person really left to fight this fight for Gail was Elaine. But she was also feeling a little bit demotivated, and she was like, you know what? At least we did manage to lay her body to rest. I will take that and move on with my life. So Elaine kept it moving. Part 2 is covering episodes 5 to 9. Episode 5 kicks off with Carol receiving a phone call from Bob. Bob was like, oh, hey, Carol. Remember, they haven't spoken in years. He broke up with her after 6 months of dating, and they haven't spoken since, and now he's calling her. And Carol's like, hi. He's like, oh, I'm engaged to this lady named Janet, and she's getting a little cold feet. She doesn't really want to get married anymore. And it's because she found out about Gail. And Carol's like, okay. Well, congratulations. I still don't know what you're calling me for. And Bob is like, I just need advice. She's getting cold feet. Help me. What do I do? What do I say? And Carol's like, just tell her the truth, whatever that is. And I guess whatever truth Bob tells Janet seems to work, because they do actually get married. Now, after receiving this phone call, Carol obviously runs to her girls and she's like, yo, Bob called me. He's engaged. Do you think we should tell Janet about what we suspect is going on? And the ladies discuss it for a while and eventually decide they're not going to tell Janet anything, which I agree with them on, because is Janet going to listen? You guys are just currently working on speculation, right? So, like I said, Bob does eventually get married to Janet. They get married in New York, and Bob is smart. I mean, he is smart. He's a surgeon, so it's reasonable to assume he's smart, but he's really good at covering his tracks, because he files his marriage certificate in New York, meaning he files Gail's birth certificate in New York, meaning wherever else he travels to, wherever else he goes to live, this won't follow him. And he does move. Him and Janet moved to North Dakota. While Bob is busy being a newlywed and living his best life in North Dakota, some things are happening behind the scenes in New York. Now, if you watch enough true crime videos, listen to enough podcasts, you'll know there's always that one person that just can't let it go. And in this case, it is Andy, who was the lead DA in the investigation. If you remember, the case had been passed on to the district attorney's office, but it did go cold eventually because they just couldn't find any new leads. They couldn't find any evidence. So it ended up going cold. But Andy was not letting it go. Andy was actually convinced that Bob killed Gail, and he was not resting until he figured something out, until he found some more evidence, until something happened. He actually was adamant not to retire until he got Bob. What Andy did was he reached out to Dan and Steve, who were investigators for cold cases within the DA. And he gave them Gail's file. He was like, browse through this, see what you come up with. One night, Dan and Steve go through this file and they're finding some things that are like, this is interesting. Let's dig further into this. This could be a lead. And one of the things they do is they call Bob's psychiatrist. If you remember, Bob's psychiatrist actually wrote a letter to Gail being like, lady, he's crazy. He's going to kill you. And this psychiatrist has not changed his tune, okay? He's still like, lady, he's crazy. But he says this to Dan and Steve when they call him. He actually says to them, of course he killed Gail. He's a psychopath. A psychiatrist is saying this. Bob is cray-cray. Some years have gone by. It's now 1998, and Elaine is a successful family lawyer. If you remember from part 1, she actually stopped writing her bar exam because she just wanted to figure out what was going on with her sister. She was trying to find her sister. But success, she does end up becoming a family lawyer. One day, she's sitting in her office and she gets a phone call from Andy. And he's telling her that they would like to open up Gail's cold case. And Elaine is like, oh, that's great. She just, in passing in the conversation, mentions the torso that they found. And Andy's like, what are you talking about? And through this, they discover that the police departments never actually communicated with each other. So because the body was found in Staten Island, that police department never communicated to the Manhattan police that they found this torso. So this is a missing part in Gail's file that not even Andy knew about. After Andy calls Elaine and gets her go-ahead on reopening the case, Dan and Steve get to work. Years had gone by and attitudes towards domestic violence and how it was being policed had changed. In 1994, the Violence Against Women Act was passed by Congress, and they put $1.6 billion towards investigation and prosecution of violent crimes against women. Police departments were being trained on how to deal with spousal abuse. The district attorney's office introduced victim impact prosecutors. With all that said, the report that Gail had made on Bob, where he choked her for finding her smoking back in 1985, would have been taken a lot more seriously now. So that's something that Dan and Steve could work on. They're like, this is in the file. This is something we can work with. Dan and Steve traveled to Vegas, and their whole thing is they're redoing the entire investigation. Years have gone by. People's attitudes have changed. People that were interviewed back then may not have been willing to give out certain information that they might be willing to give out now. So we're just redoing everything. And in this, they travel to Vegas. This is when the ladies come in. Carol wonders if they're about to ruin Bob's life by speaking to Dan and Steve and telling them all the speculations that they've had in their little group of gossip. Carol's like, it was all fun and games when we were just chit-chatting, meeting over coffee, but now it's serious. There's investigators that are coming to get our statements. So she's a little bit worried. And she's like, if anything does happen, I don't want to be a part of it like that. But Carol, you are a part of it, girl. Dan and Steve continue with their investigations. They do interviews with people who knew Bob, and everyone has somewhat of a story to tell. After being in Vegas, they go back to New York and they interview Roberta. Roberta was a medical student who Bob supervised, and they dated, guess what? Right after Gail died. Roberta was actually in the apartment when Elaine went to go pick up Gail's belongings when Bob put them in trash bags. Roberta is the lady that he was seeing at the time. And she is like, one night they were laying in bed and Bob gets a phone call to come and identify a body. And what he says to her is, I don't really want to go. I know it's not her. How do you know this? How do you know this, Bob? So Roberta is like, you killed her, didn't you? And apparently Bob is silent. He says nothing. This is when she starts getting a little bit worried. She calls up her friend who suggests that they track Bob's movements on the day of Gail's disappearance. And if you recall, Bob is a pilot. So the friend is like, why don't you track his flight log? See what happened on that day. And they discovered that the flight log was altered. Now, why are you changing things on the flight log if you're not like guilty, sir? What are you doing? Dan and Steve were feeling a lot more confident about their case this time around. There's people who didn't want to talk to any investigators back when the first investigations were being done, who've actually spoken to them now. And attitudes towards domestic violence have changed overall. So they're like, we're feeling a little bit more confident. We feel like we can actually charge this man with something. Before they can go ahead with that, they want to cover their backs. And they're like, yes, we know a torso was found, but are we sure this is Gail? Because back in 1989, all they did were x-ray comparisons. They didn't actually do any type of DNA testing. But now DNA capabilities were so much better. And they're like, we want to test it. But to do this, they had to exhume the body. And they spoke to Elaine about this, and Elaine was like a little iffy about it. But you know what? If it's going to help us, let's do it. They do exhume the torso, and they do some DNA tests, only to discover that the torso did not belong to Gail. This is really sad. It takes away any form of closure that Elaine felt that she had, but it does sort of help in the case because it does take away any kind of doubt that the jury could have in the case, because they do have to pass a case beyond any reasonable doubt. And it helps that at least the torso wasn't Gail's. In 1999, Bob finally gets charged with Gail's murder. This is 14 years later. For the trial, the case is really hinged on testimony from the ladies. And because of this, the ladies do kind of start doubting themselves. They're like, yeah, I could testify, but this is all speculation. This was all just us girls sitting in a coffee shop speculating. Are we right about this? Like, are we about to change this whole man's life just because we speculated? Bob does go on trial in the year 2000, which is 15 years after Gail's death. The trial lasted 9 days. And the defense argument was that there wasn't enough evidence that Bob killed Gail. In the podcast, transcripts are actually read from the trial, and it's really just back and forth and people doubting that certain things happen and the defense saying, is there really evidence to this? Now, Bob is like, I'm not guilty. I'm not going to testify. I'm not going to say anything. I'm not guilty. Leave me alone. However, the jury did find him guilty, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He served his 20 years, and through all these years, He maintained his innocence. The man even appealed his case because he was like, I'm innocent. I'm innocent. Take me out of here. I'm innocent. Right? Right. In 2020, when Bob came up for parole after 20 years of being incarcerated, you know what this man does? He admits to killing Gail. Now, this is the story that Bob tells. He says him and Gail were arguing when things escalated. He says he attacked her by strangling her. He was frightened about what happened after strangling her, so he left the apartment to go for a walk. When he went for this walk, he made a few phone calls and he hired a plane. He says that he came back home, he carried her dead body into the rented plane, and he dropped her over the ocean. Sir, you did what? This is how our podcast ends. The man maintained his innocence. When he finally came out for parole, he says, guess what? I did it. Of course, he's still in prison because what? Anyways, the ladies discuss this. They speak to Elaine. They ask her how she feels about it. And they're like, you know what? As much as, yes, we started this little girl group talking about how Bob killed his ex-wife, none of us really wanted to believe that we dated a murderer. So things got a little bit too real. And it's really like crazy how for years this man said he didn't do it. For years he was behind bars for something he said he didn't do. And then finally he's like, yeah, this is how I did it. I'm so glad we got to discuss this podcast together because the twists and turns that were in it left me gagged, okay? It started off as a few ladies just talking about an ex, venting about an ex, to all of this. Like, sir, you are dumping bodies across the ocean. What? And this actually like lets you know not to just trust people. This man was a surgeon. He was a pilot. He spoke multiple languages. Like, he just seemed so perfect on paper. But look what he's capable of. That's insane, okay? That's crazy. Anyways, if there's any other podcast that you guys are listening to that you'd like to discuss, please let me know. Also, not just podcasts, any topics, any true crime videos or documentaries that you know of that you want us to talk about. Your girl's here for you. We can discuss it in detail, okay? Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. Guys, let me know what you think of Bob. Like, this man is crazy. See you guys in my next video.